Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, the National Wildlife Federation, and Reimagine Appalachia for this special event on reimagining the Civilian Conservation Corps, which you all know was an important and historic initiative of the Depression era. I'm George Frampton. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. This event is on the record. We're live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about today's discussion, share on social media. You can use the hashtag AC Energy, tag us at AC Global Energy. Those who are joining us by Zoom can submit questions in the Q&A portal at the bottom of your Zoom screen. At any time during the event, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us and to hear from Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. Senator Casey's long been an advocate for reestablishing the CCC, served in Pennsylvania state government for more than a decade as state auditor and treasurer of Pennsylvania, is now in his third term in the U.S. Senate, where he serves on the Finance, Health, Education, and Labor, and Select Intelligence Committees. After we hear from Senator Casey, Colin O'Mara, President and CEO of National Wildlife Federation, which has also worked very hard to recreate a new CCC, Colin will introduce and moderate a panel on the status of current efforts. Senator Casey, thank you very much for being with us today. There's obviously some real momentum in Congress for a new CCC to create jobs, train workers, address climate, promote environmental justice, conserve state and federal lands. At least 4 bills have been introduced, and you just told me that you introduced your bill just this morning. And it appears that there's work going on and a commitment, at least on the part of the leadership, to get some version of a new CCC into a budget reconciliation bill is ongoing. So we're very pleased to have you just talk a little bit about how you see a reestablished CCC and your bill designed to address underemployment, land rehabilitation, agriculture in Pennsylvania, and also where you see this effort going to actually enact legislation over the next weeks and months, either through separate bill or through reconciliation.
Well, George, thanks very much. I appreciate you hosting us and making the introduction that you did. I'm honored by that. And I want to thank you, the Atlantic Council, Reimagine Appalachia, as well as the National Wildlife Federation, or Foundation, I should say, for this opportunity. The bill that we just introduced today is the Revived Ccc Act. And really, it's as you know, one of a number of proposals, both in the House and the Senate. And as you made reference to, we're at a point in our history where we're about to, if my side of the argument prevails, we're about to make substantial investments in a whole range of priorities, from physical infrastructure to caregiving to job creation. So many areas of our life, so many areas of the human family of America that has not been invested in for growth and for progress, and especially as we want to move to the aftermath of this pandemic, which I know we're still struggling with. But this Civilian Conservation Corps idea is, of course, not a new idea, but it's an idea, I think, whose time has come, especially with the majorities in Congress now and the focus that the president has placed upon not just rebuilding, not just building back, but as he has said over and over again, building back better. And one of the ways we build back better is to have an initiative like this. What we're calling for here is a substantial investment in a revitalized Civilian Conservation Corps to do a number of things. First of all, to support sustainable agriculture, to support our waterways, our public lands, and the health and resiliency of our communities, both rural and urban. Through a revitalized CCC, we can create the next generation of conservationists. And that's an especially important word in Pennsylvania, because we have a long history. 50 years ago, we passed an amendment to our Constitution, which was known as the Conservation and Environmental Amendment. Article 1, Section 27, the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. And then the amendment goes on to say that we are, as citizens of the state, trustees of the lands of our Commonwealth for future generations. So when we talk about a civilian conservation corps, it will not just ring a few bells nationally, but a lot of Pennsylvanians will know that from our history. But we also want to support the next generation of farmers and leaders who are committed to taking on the climate crisis and while protecting and enhancing our shared natural resources. Just to give you some broad framework for the legislation, we obviously want federal resources for this, no question about that, just as they did in the 30s. But these have to be, in my judgment, locally led projects. The legislation will ensure that we're putting our local communities in the driver's seat when it comes to the design of CCC projects. We also want to make sure that we empower local or state organizations to serve as hosts for CCC members, allowing them to design the most relevant projects and train and support the next generation of leaders. And only they can do that. You don't want a Washington, D.C. down kind of program. Here's some examples of host entities that would be eligible under the legislation. They could include, for example, a local conservation district could be a host, a state agency could be a host, an organization focused on land reclamation. We have a lot of need for that in Pennsylvania. Or in fact, a host could be a farmer, himself or herself, because the wisdom and experience that they can bring to bear on this next generation of leaders is really immeasurable. I also wanted to make a quick reference to a point that we make in the legislation that relates to the type of land. We're going to make sure that we're including both public and private lands in this effort. We know that agricultural conservation and best management practices on private lands can offer enormous public benefits, even though they happen on private lands, benefiting all kinds of ways and benefiting us all kinds of ways, improving water quality, sequestering carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of the attention that's given to the role of CCC jobs in this and other pieces of legislation focuses on public lands, and that's appropriate. But I think we need to make sure that we don't forget to prioritize and support conservation jobs on private lands. This legislation will ensure that experienced farmers can serve, as I mentioned before, as a host to a group of core members. Let me make one final point before we get to questions or comments. George, you made reference earlier to what the reckoning we're starting to have when it comes to environmental justice, among many other questions we're finally beginning to wrestle with. There's no question that in a state like ours, which has 67 counties, 48 are rural, we also have a lot of major urban areas or small towns which these environmental justice issues are relevant. A legacy of environmental injustice in frontline communities throughout our Commonwealth and throughout our country has to be addressed. For far too long, the legacy of systemic racism or purposeful disinvestment or just flawed environmental policies have overburdened low-income communities and communities of color, putting the health and safety of those residents at greater risk. That's why this legislation includes provisions to ensure that these frontline communities are prioritized for investment through a new civilian conservation corps. Just by way of some examples, measures to address environmental justice issues like air quality, transportation, access to green space, and of course, safe, affordable housing, among others. So we have a lot to do, and I know that some will say, well, this could be a big investment, or well, you won't come to consensus. in the Congress, or you may not come to consensus between and among Democrats. I think that's all wrong. I think we will. I think Democrats understand, I hope a few Republicans understand as well, that we're at a moment in time where we have to make transformative investments that may not have gained consensus even a year or two ago, but we have to move forward, whether it's investing in our children with early care and learning, whether it's investing in better education, more educational opportunities for the workforce of the future, whether it's investing in, as I've been working on night and day, home and community-based services for seniors and people with disabilities, and as well the investments in our physical infrastructure, whether it's roads and bridges, broadband, the electricity grid, water and sewer, you know the long list. This is a time to go big and to be bold. And it's time, I believe, for a new civilian conservation corps. So thanks very much.
Senator, thank you. I think you deserve a lot of credit for the way you've crafted this. I'm struck by the fact that I think your bill reflects the work that's been done by all three of the organizations sponsoring this event, that economic development funding from the federal government has really got to work, has got to go to projects that are designed locally by people who know what's needed, know what the problems are, know how jobs can be fashioned that are going to address those problems, not by the federal government in Washington. I'm interested, though, that in asking you that California has a state CCC, and a lot of it's done through junior colleges. And the idea is that's where you can get training, as well as not just creating jobs, but creating training, more like traditional labor union apprenticeship programs. Are junior colleges and local educational facilities able to be hosts under your bill, your approach?
Yes, because we want to keep it as local as we can. And there's no question that whether it's, you make reference to a junior college in Pennsylvania, we've had more over time, more so-called community colleges, but it's the same kind of educational institution. But those are the kind of local entities that I think could be hosts. And in a particular community, if a community college is not a host, it could as well be a partner,
participating partner, yeah,
in developing the program that local community needs.
It was a big press conference yesterday. There are lots and lots of Democrats signed on to letters in favor of this. What are the chances of getting some? Hard to imagine something that ought to have more bipartisan support. What do you think the chances are of getting some Republican support?
Well, it's in my judgment, it's difficult to imagine, at least in the current dynamic, a lot of bipartisan support. I think the most likely, or the more likely scenario is this would be done maybe through the reconciliation process. I hope, as you know, we're what we believed we were hours away from proceeding to a physical infrastructure bill. That's my definition of it. But it looks like we're not going to get to that today in terms of a successful vote. Still think it's important to have the vote to create some clarity in Washington, or at least in the Senate. But it's possible, I think it's more likely than not, that we will have a bipartisan bill that deals with a range of physical infrastructure priorities as the president negotiated. If this can be part of that, that would be ideal, because then you would have something that's bipartisan and worked out and completed before we get to the long list of reconciliation priorities. But I'm in favor of getting it done either in the more near-term bipartisan process or the longer-term reconciliation process.
Your bill is very strong on emphasizing sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. Pennsylvania has a real challenge on land reclamation issues as well. Is this a way to address some of those issues, to be able to put people to work in land reclamation, which is, of course, tied into sustainable regenerative agriculture?
Yes, no question about it. This is part of that. We have a state that, as you know, had a long history of extraction. We still have some of that today with natural gas, but we had, of course, generation after generation of extraction of coal, both the hard coal, the so-called anthracite coal that I grew up around in northeastern Pennsylvania, and then in western Pennsylvania, we had the bituminous coal fields in southwestern Pennsylvania. So that's a legacy which we're still wrestling with by way of land reclamation and water and a lot of our natural resources. So these jobs can meet that need, in addition to just the opportunity for a young person deciding on a career to learn about farming, to learn about sustainable agriculture, as you made reference to learn about ways to preserve the land that we're so blessed by in a state like Pennsylvania.
Senator, we're almost up, but there's one interesting question from an audience member pointing out that in the 30s, part of the CCC experience was members living together in barracks or camps that were actually built by the CCC, and learning and getting some technical assistance from partners. Is there a way to recreate that in a regenerative CCC?
I hope there is a way to create that kind of collaboration. And obviously young people have the experience often of going to an institution of higher education for 2 years or 4 years, and then sometimes even beyond that, where they're living in settings where they're around their fellow, as the case may be, undergraduate students. So I hope we can create that same kind of collaboration and synergy that only an educational environment can provide. This in a sense becomes, in my judgment, an extension of education for so many young Americans. But we'll have to see what local communities want to design, but I'd certainly be open to that idea.
So thank you. Go ahead.
George, I just wanted to mention one name. You know, there's a name that you may not have heard right next to Teddy Roosevelt, and that's Gifford Pinchot. He was a governor of our state, but long before that, he was known as the leading conservationist really in the country. And Pennsylvania often did it the wrong way when it came to not protecting communities. People like Gifford Pinchot 100 years ago were inspiring us to do it the right way. So we hope that can be further inspiration in addition to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his team did.
Senator, I wrote an introduction to the last republication of his autobiography. Thank you so much for your work on this and for joining us today. Really appreciate your being here. And
Thanks very much. Thank you.
So now I'm going to turn it over to Colin to introduce our very interesting panel and moderate it. Colin, over to you.
Hey, thanks, George. And thanks to be with you. And it's actually kind of funny you did bring up Pinchot at the end, because it was Gifford Pinchot who actually advised President Franklin Roosevelt at the end of his career to actually create the CCC for New York State before he was president, kind of the pilot project that led to the discussion that we're having today. So, George, it's a huge thank you for your great leadership and the Atlantic Council for providing us this forum. A huge thank you to Senator Casey. And, for those of you who had a chance to work with Senator Casey and his team, some of the best, most diligent, staff work on legislating you've ever seen. The bill that he's putting forward today, I just can't applaud his leadership enough. This idea of locally led and kind of a locally led approach to CCC on both private and public lands, focusing on reclamation, focusing on agriculture, focusing on, on this idea of both rural and urban is truly inclusive. And they focus on environmental justice to ensure that all jobs and resources are centered where they're needed. I think is going to be an incredibly important contribution to the conversation that's going to happen across the Congress. So we will look forward to working with Senator Casey. We appreciate him working so closely with Aviva and Jessica and all the members of our team. But we're really excited about his 21st century vision for a modern civilian conservation corps. And look, his bill comes at a critical moment, George. I mean, our economy is still recovering from the pandemic. We have millions of Americans that are still looking for work. We're in the middle of a racial reckoning. We're obviously facing more extreme climate impacts. And when President Roosevelt faced a similar economic challenge, the reason he turned to the CCC is that he needed to find a way to help millions of young Americans that were sidelined by the Depression find desperately needed employment as a way to restore and to do that in a way that had all these additional benefits that we're still benefiting from today, from the restoration of public lands, our parks, our waterways, and making communities more resilient. So the need, I would argue, is as great today as it was in 1933 when the program was first created. And there's a huge backlog of restoration needs. And we estimate at the National Wildlife Federation that there's more than $200 billion of restoration work that we need to do over the next 5 years. And these are projects that are already ready to go. And the CCC kind of workforce could be a huge part of that future. Right now, millions of Americans are unemployed, particularly young people, people of color. There's about 8 million fewer people employed today than prior to the pandemic. The unemployment rate for young people from ages 20 to 24 remains in double digits in many parts of the country. The Black and Latino unemployment rates are still well above those of white Americans. And that's on top of what we're seeing just kind of unfold before our eyes right now with more and more extreme climate impacts. I mean, the hurricanes that kind of came up the East Coast. By the time Elsa came up the East Coast, it wasn't even a hurricane. It was barely a tropical depression. Yet the flooding from everywhere, from the coastal communities in the Carolinas up to the flooding we saw in New York City was horrific. We're on pace to have the worst fire season in U.S. history. Over 1 million acres burned already, and we're barely in July. The incredible heat wave that we saw in the Northwest. And then we're seeing record drought right now in more than 12 states. So you put all that together, and the time is now to kind of have this kind of work. And we believe very strongly that a 21st century civilian conservation corps could really address these needs in a way that also advances equity and justice and provides sustainable career pathways for participants, particularly pre-apprenticeship programs for labor participation, for joining a union, making sure that those linkages that were kind of promised when AmeriCorps was being created during the Clinton administration, but never quite came to realization. We want to make sure this is work that supplements and does not supplant any union work. And at the same time, creates an opportunity for young folks that want to join a union and have those good family sustaining jobs to be able to do so. And so to achieve this vision, we think two things are important. The first thing is that the program should scale successful local work. And the program must center the needs of our most vulnerable communities, particularly in Appalachia. And so, the good news, and one of the things I'm so excited about this panel today that I'll be moderating in just a second, is that we have a bunch of really great models to pull from. I'm hoping you're going to hear a lot of detail from these, George, and to the rest of you watching right now in the time ahead. There are outdoor recreation groups, there are economic development organizations, there's farming cooperatives, youth-led environmental groups, all of whom, there's a kind of this robust network, all of whom are already doing this type of core work on the ground that we believe it can make a CCC successful. And again, why Senator Casey's approach, I think, is so visionary in that he's trying to lift up these kind of locally designed solutions. Right now, the Appalachian Conservation Corps, it's a program of conservation legacy. They have a nationwide network of conservation service organizations, and it's meaningful work on public lands and trying to create land stewards. The West Virginia Community Development Hub supports dozens of communities with funding and technical assistance to help build up rural economies and uplift communities. The Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers of Pittsburgh Cooperative, again, working with local Black communities to grow food, to share Black cultural traditions, to educate and advocate around food security. Incredibly exciting work. The Appalachian Ohio Restore Corps is an AmeriCorps program through Rural Action Ohio, which builds a more just economy by developing the region's assets in an environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable way. They work in everything from watershed restoration to tourism education to invasive species management, just great works. And these are just 4 of dozens of programs in Appalachia already that could scale up with the kind of investments that Senator Casey and his colleagues are envisioning. So as we look to scale up what works, we also need to really be intentional about centering the expertise, the concerns, and the voices of frontline communities and communities of color that for generations have borne the brunt of pollution. We do have sacrifice zones that we need to make sure we're addressing those historic inequities to make sure they benefit from the federal investment in the CCC. And part of this is going to be tracking, reporting, and creating mechanisms for accountability to ensure that vulnerable communities are able to benefit from the federal investments in the CCC. And just yesterday, Kamala Harris and Vice President Harris and President Biden announced new guidelines for how the Environmental Justice 40 which is the initiative to make sure that 40% of the investments benefit frontline communities and communities that are struggling, making sure that that's real. And so this obviously plays into that conversation in a major way. The Appalachian region in particular, I think, stands to benefit from a new CCC. And look, this is in large part to the incredible leadership of Reimagine Appalachia. I mean, like they have been, the amazing mosaic of organizations across the region has been talking about the importance of a civilian conservation corps as a cornerstone of this idea of revitalizing and reimagining the region from the very beginning. And so I think they deserve a huge amount of credit for the leadership and supporting the efforts of Senator Casey, but frankly, nationwide, and showing that reclamation, restoration, and regenerative agriculture can be a big part of creating opportunity. Where, frankly, in a region of the country that has powered the nation for almost a century, we need to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind as the economy transitions. And really, we should respect those just amazing families and communities that really allowed America to win the American century. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but the reason why part of the arsenal that we are today is because of amazing leadership in Appalachia, and that should be recognized, supported, and lifted up and revitalized. And so, this is a way to address some of the chronic unemployment, the economic downturn, the pollution, the ravaged landscapes in some cases, and of course, the opioid epidemic in the region. It's a way to make sure that the communities aren't left behind, and we're respecting those that powered the past, and that we're repairing this damage with the next generation of workers, hopefully creating all kinds of business opportunities and revitalization opportunities. And so I could not be more excited. As you can tell, I'm kind of hyperventilating because I'm so excited about this conversation. And our leaders today on this panel represent the full spectrum. We got leaders from economic development, social justice, labor, from conservation, who are doing and just supporting great work on the ground in all parts of Appalachia and around the country. And we hope that you'll learn from them to hear about how each of their unique perspectives could help shape what the CCC should look like on the ground. So, okay, so enough from me. I probably prattled on too long, but I want to introduce the panelists really quick in the order they're going to speak. I'm going to introduce everybody at once. Each of them are going to speak for about 3 minutes, and then we're going to get into a great question and answer screen. And so I encourage you to submit your question by clicking in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and putting a question right there, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can after the panel. So our first speaker, Harry Johnson II, the Government Affairs and Policy Manager at Dream Corps. He leads the federal affairs work for Dream Corps' Green for All program, which promotes wealth and health and through equitable investment and innovation in clean transportation, clean energy, and job policies. Harry is a national expert in national and government affairs leader. He's a serial entrepreneur, a community builder, and has extensive experience working with Southwest Pennsylvania region. We love working with the Dream Corps, and we're really excited, Harry, that you're with us today.
Thank you so much, Colin. Really happy to be here. I want to first thank the Atlantic Council, National Wildlife Federation, Reimagine Appalachia, and of course, Senator Casey. As a Pittsburgh native, very supportive of the work that Senator Casey and staff in this team are doing. And so, yeah, I think this is really important to, one, look at how we tackle the lack of economic opportunity, as well as the need to reduce carbon emissions here in the country. As you briefly mentioned, Dream Corps Green for All was founded back in 2007 by Van Jones. We seek to prioritize investments in communities that face the greatest barrier to accessing the clean economy due to historical underinvestment. We also work to support small businesses and ownership opportunities through community solar, renewable energy, and other clean tech industries. And just as a side, we recently launched the National Business Council for Black and Brown CEOs in the clean tech sector, hoping to help support and provide more wealth building pathways for Black and Brown CEOs and access to capital and greater networks in this industry and clean economy. So again, so happy to be here. Looking forward to this great conversation with our panelists. And thanks again for having me.
Great. Thanks, Harry. Thanks so much for being with us. Our second speaker is Dr. Elisa Manspiezer, who's Executive Director of Land Force. And Elisa is an anthropologist with 30 years of experience working in community-based development and natural resource conservation, both in the U.S. and abroad. At Land Force, she works closely with a coalition of public and private agencies, as well as a network of green space and workforce development experts to recruit, train, educate, and employ skilled crews who restore and maintain lands and green assets. Elisa?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Colin. Thanks to the Atlantic Council, Reimagine Appalachia, and the National Wildlife Federation for including Land Force in this important conservation. And thanks to Senator Casey for all of the work on his Conservation Corps bill today. We count ourselves extremely lucky to already be doing the work that is being highlighted in his bill and in today's conversation. Land Force is a social enterprise nonprofit that serves people living in Pittsburgh and the neighborhoods immediately surrounding it within Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. We provide jobs, job training, and transitional job support for the people who need it most, all while working to improve our environment. We provide the tools and opportunity for people to achieve their goals and aspirations, whether they are citizens returning from incarceration, managing addiction, mental health diagnoses, homelessness, or living in poverty. These are the people who we need to ensure will benefit from this bill. In our case, that means the vast majority of whom are Black men in their 20s and 30s and even up to their 60s, who have been excluded in the past from good opportunities like these. We bring on 25 crew members a year with intensive trainings focused on hard and soft skills such as basic carpentry, trail construction, plant identification, and habitat restoration. We also offer the opportunity for crew members to get chainsaw, HAZWOPER, OSHA 40, tree tender, and National Green Infrastructure certifications. We provide financial literacy, a work ethic curriculum, resume writing, job searching, and interview practice, while the entire training and crew member experience is set within the context of restorative practices and trauma-informed care. Centering our crew members and their lived experiences is an essential part of what we do and of any effective workforce development program or conservation corps. And having organizations like ours act as hosts will ensure that the people benefit as much as the place.
Great. Thanks so much. We're looking forward to having you on the panel. It's good to see you again. Our third speaker is Michael French, who's the Director of Operations at Green Forest Work. GFW is a Kentucky-based nonprofit whose mission is to restore native forest habitat on lands that were impacted by coal surface mining. Michael has supervised the planting of millions of acres of millions of trees across Appalachia. He also serves as the co-chair of the science team of the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative. We are thrilled to have you with us from the great Commonwealth of Kentucky today. Michael?
Thank you, Colin, and I'd like to thank you all for having me. I'd like to thank the Senator and everyone else who is working on revitalizing the CCC. As Colin mentioned, Green Forest's Work is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to restore healthy, productive forests on formerly mined lands all across the Appalachian region. When Congress passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, they were really looking to address human health and safety issues and water quality parameters. They were looking to eliminate the landslides that were commonplace in the 50s and 60s. They were looking to improve water quality and prevent boulders from coming down hillsides and killing people. But when they did so and they began implementing this law, coal companies began packing the material back up against the hillsides really tight with heavy equipment so it wouldn't go anywhere. And then they began seeding areas with non-native aggressive grasses and legumes. And when they tried to plant trees in these areas, it was like planting trees in a gravel parking lot. The ground was just so tight that the trees couldn't grow. And reforestation in Appalachia, reforestation failures really became commonplace. So unfortunately, mining companies began using hay pasture land or unmanaged wildlife habitat as common post-mining land uses, and they converted from the 1980s through the early 2000s about 1 million acres of what were biodiverse Appalachian forests into these non-native grasslands. And when they were left unmanaged, which many of them were, other invasive exotic species could come into these areas, which further inhibited native forest regeneration. So GFW was formed to address this problem by working with public land managers and private landowners who wanted forests back on their lands, but didn't have the means to do so or the knowledge base. And we based what we're doing on decades of research. We knew that trees would grow on these areas. So what we did is we began hiring heavy equipment operators to come in and clear out the unwanted vegetation. Then they used bulldozers with large ripping shanks mounted on the back to rip up all of that compacted ground, basically like tilling your garden, except on a forest scale. It allows tree roots to extend easily in all directions. It improves water quality by allowing rainwater to infiltrate the soil and be more slowly released from the system. And sometimes we create wetlands on these areas, utilizing heavy equipment again. And then we use a large labor force of volunteer tree planters and professional tree planting companies to come in and plant a biodiverse mix of native trees and shrubs that would mimic the forest that was there prior to the mining. So through these projects, we've really been looking to address two needs of the Appalachian region, environmental improvement, but also providing jobs and creating future economic opportunities by providing a resource base in timber and non-timber forest products. So by restoring these lands and reforesting them, we're really restoring the ecosystem services that forests provide to society, from clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, buffering storm events and mitigating flash flooding, as well as increasing the productivity of the land to more rapidly accumulate carbon and mitigate the climate crisis. And simultaneously, we're providing jobs for seed collectors, tree nursery workers, heavy equipment operators, and professional tree planters. Since 2009, we've planted about 4 million trees across more than 6,000 acres of the Appalachian region, but we've really just scratched the surface. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of acres out there that could be improved through further reforestation practices. And our organization was initially proposed during the Great Recession as a CCC-style program that would put out-of-work coal miners and Appalachian citizens back to work in their communities, doing these restoration practices and planting trees. And that's what we're doing today, although on a much smaller scale than was originally envisioned. We're hiring local contractors, we're purchasing from local nurseries, and we're employing Appalachian citizens. To do this work, we work with numerous state and federal agencies, partnering nonprofits, educational institutions, and others. And we've engaged more than 22,000 participants in our events over the years, from our volunteers, which have included more than 11,000 under the age of 24. We've employed NCCC teams in this work. We've employed Conservation Legacy, Appalachian Conservation Corps teams. So I was really encouraged to hear Senator Casey's remarks about, scaling this up, because this is something that's much needed now, and it's something that we're really ready for. So for now, I'll just leave it at that, and I'll turn it back over to Colin. But again, I'd like to thank you all for having me here.
Michael, thank you so much. And I appreciate the point on the importance of ecologically appropriate restoration. I mean, I do think that, we got to learn from the mistakes of the past. So I think there's a great opportunity there. Our fourth and final speaker is my dear friend, Jason Walsh, who's the executive director of the Blue-Green Alliance. Jason has more than 20 years of experience at the state and federal levels in policy and advocacy across a range of issues, including climate, clean energy, economics, and workforce development. His previous roles include leading the Obama administration's efforts to try to align and scale up federal investments in workers and communities impacted by the shift away from coal in the power sector. And I'll just say that he's one of the most effective policymakers that I've ever worked with, seeing how the environment and the economy fit together and how they're mutually reinforcing as opposed to competing. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you, my friend. That was quite a generous introduction. And thank you to NWF and the Atlantic Council and Reimagine Appalachia for convening this really important conversation. The Blue-Green Alliance, for those of you who don't know us, is a national partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations, of which NWF is one, representing millions of members and supporters. The guiding principle of our coalition is that we don't have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. We can, and we must have both. The Civilian Conservation Corps is an idea that actually embodies that principle. And it could not come at a more important time. Workers across the country are still digging out from the economic impacts of COVID. Colin, you talked about this a little bit, but as of June, the official unemployment rate in the US still stood at 6%, as high as 8% in some states, but that only tells part of the story. Black Americans are almost twice as likely to be unemployed compared to white Americans. And the unemployment rate for young workers is over 15% for Black Americans, over 10% for Hispanic Americans. And that's not even talking about underemployment and who we're no longer counting as unemployed. The economic effects of COVID have, at the same time, exposed and exacerbated what were already historic levels of inequality in this country. Since the start of 2020, the richest 1% in the US have gained $10 trillion in wealth, which is over 15 times more than the wealth gained by the entire bottom 50% of this country over the same period. This is both obscene and unsustainable, which is why it's so important that Congress passes economic recovery and jobs legislation at scale that centers on the better in Build Back Better. George talked about that a little bit. Taking head on the intersecting crises of climate change and economic and racial injustice while creating high quality, accessible jobs and delivering a more equitable and cleaner economy. A civilian conservation corps can be central to achieving that outcome. Senator Casey and other members of Congress have provided blueprints to create a modernized CCC, creating millions of jobs for unemployed workers and projects across the country to build healthier and more resilient communities. These jobs should be good jobs that provide workers with wages and benefits that allow them to support themselves and their families as they complete these projects. And it must include strong protections against public and private sector job displacement. This is all to say that rebooting the CCC to truly meet the moment means placing equity at its foundation and structuring it to provide workers with not only good jobs in the CCC, but intentional pathways into longer-term careers, which will require building out partnership models that already exist between corps and unions and between pre-apprenticeship and registered apprenticeship programs and other high-quality training programs. And to truly ensure that the CCC is helping us rebuild a fairer and more equitable economy, we should prioritize hiring workers from communities that need it the most, especially in low-income communities, communities of color, and communities facing environmental injustice and deindustrialization. And Appalachia, unfortunately, is at the intersection of all of that. Bottom line, the CCC is a great example of how America's environmental challenges can also be economic opportunities. If we do this right, we can quickly put millions of people back to work, create pathways into high-quality family-sustaining jobs, and build a more resilient country. It's a triple win, and we should get it done. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you, Jason. And thank you all for your great comments. I actually want to pick up my first question to the panel, kind of where Jason left off, which is like over the past half century, there's been a ton of promises to Appalachia, right? Promises of investment, promises of revitalization, reclamation. I mean, Michael, you're running a great program that was promised a lot more resources than you got. Jason, you spent a lot of time, trying to drive investments from the Obama administration that never really materialized. I mean, Harry, the amazing work you're doing, Elisa, the same thing. I mean, I'd like to talk about how do we make sure that we're intentional to achieve the last point that Jason just made around making sure that the investments wind up in the places and spaces, the communities that have been hardest hit, the investments that are most needed. How do we make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? And how do we make sure we're lifting up communities, making sure that the individuals, the communities, the places that need the investment the most are the ones that get them, specifically in an Appalachian context. So I'll just open it up to everybody, but I just think making sure that we actually get past the rhetoric into real results on the ground.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think one, building off what Jason said, I think there are networks that already exist that we just need to really make sure have equity at their core. Organizations that are already doing great work. How do we really look at those closely and invest in those that are really making true impact? I think also when the CCC is enacted through legislation, once leadership is put in place, I think there needs to be a person of color or a group of people of color that are leading that initiative or work. They come from communities of color and communities that have been disadvantaged and disinvested in. I think this can really create a lot of great jobs, but we also need to look at pathways of wealth building through this and long-term jobs, not just short-term jobs. I think, how do we really look at this as a pathway to build careers and not just a short-term Band-Aid solution. So I think the makings of having a great CC to make sure that this really truly invests in people is there, but we really need to have long-term vision and long-term planning on how we really enact and make sure that we have folks at the core that understand what communities of color and environmental justice communities are going through that are helping making these decisions from the top down. So I'll pass it on to Michael. I think he wants to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I would echo what Senator Casey said and what Jason said as well about making this a bottom-up approach. You know, get that money into the communities that you're targeting, and they know what's needed in their communities, and they'll be able to put it to use. I mean, have faith in that. There's a great network of state and federal agencies out there that can facilitate this work, but getting it out to the existing thousands of nonprofits who know what they're doing and, you know, have already laid the groundwork for this is really the way to go with this. So I was encouraged to hear Senator Casey say that, because that would be one of the pieces of advice that I would give, you know, to the administration or anyone who's listening, is to not reinvent the wheel. I mean, a lot of these folks know what they're doing. They know what's needed. Get them the funding, get them the workforce, recruit from within those communities, and, you know, it'll be pretty amazing what happens.
Just to echo what's been said so far, ensuring that it's the experienced organizations, the ones who have experience with the people we're talking about, with the challenges that have been placed in front of them, and enabling them to move past those challenges in a way that is meaningful, and making sure that the organizations that are brought on have the talent and the experience to do so. And that the organizations that are brought on are not solely conservation organizations, but have experience working with these groups of people, and with the obstacles that are placed in front of them. And that means ensuring that the jobs are there, that the good jobs are there, that the powerful jobs are there. That I share the concern. I deeply share the concern that this will just be another set of empty promises to people who have been disappointed time and time again. We can do everything we can at Land Force to train people well, to get them ready to work, to help them reach their own goals and desires. But if the jobs are not there, and if the unions aren't reaching out and asking for our crew members to become their employees, it's not going to work in long term for our crew members.
Let me just add that I agree with everything that's just been said. I think we can't underestimate the level of underinvestment in Appalachia, both from the public sector and the private sector. And particularly now in this moment when we have the opportunity and the ability with essentially zero treasury rates to do public investment at scale, Appalachia is a part of the country that really, really needs it. We also need to be just clear-eyed about the fact that this is going to take time and that unemployed workers don't have time. And so while we're doing the longer term work of diversifying economies in a bottom-up way, people need jobs, right? And they need jobs to do all of the things and restore all of the things and clean up all the things that need to be done in communities across Appalachia. That's why the CCC is so important, that it's actually got a jobs component that can help people right now when communities are suffering and workers need not just any work, but like family sustaining, meaningful work.
No, that's great. I appreciate all of that. I'm going to kind of put together a two-part question because we're running a little short on time. But two aspirations that folks have is to make sure that many communities that were excluded in many ways from the CCC before have full participation. I mean, of the 3 million participants, I think maybe 25,000 participants in CCC were people of color. The number of Indigenous youth that participated was a fraction of that. And I'm just curious, as kind of the first question, I'll put these two together, but the first question is, how do we ensure the CCC doesn't perpetuate this kind of historical racism? How do we make sure that that are there models, are there organizations that each of you have worked with that we should be trying to replicate and scale up? But how do we make sure that we're really achieving our equity goals? The second question is that there's a huge interest in these being family sustaining jobs. Right now, the way the AmeriCorps program is set up, very low wages, small educational incentive. Most folks that participate in the programs can't afford to. It becomes a kind of a luxury for suburban kids that are taking a gap year before grad school, as opposed to a meaningful kind of first entry point into a career in some cases. It's not disparaging anything, but just, it hasn't been seen as much as a gateway into a career, as opposed to as it could be. And I think it was envisioned. Are there things that we should be doing in terms of the pathway to labor, to organize labor, to pre-apprenticeship programs, and really expanding the opportunities that these temporary jobs could lead to long-term family-sustaining careers? And so those are two questions. I know everyone doesn't want to talk on all of them, but we got about 3-4 minutes before I want to get to at least one question from the public. But I'd love folks' thoughts on either one. The question about racial equity in hiring and participation, as well as the pathways to sustainable careers.
Oh, sure. I'll jump in on the first question. Really tapping, I think, there are lots of organizations that are doing some really amazing work. Senator Casey spoke briefly about, tapping, junior colleges and universities. I think really looking at historically Black colleges, historically Hispanic colleges, tribal colleges, I think looking at those networks also to do training to make sure they're part of this equation. Are included. Often historical Black colleges are located in communities of color that can have local needs and really tap into the communities that they're serving. So I think those would be really a great place to look at for one, looking at talent, looking at really, serving those communities well. Also, Senator Casey's legislation speaks to community advisory boards overseeing some of these projects. And I think those should also be led by folks from those communities from a bottom-up approach, making sure that there's management of the projects has voices that are directly tied to those solutions that can most benefit communities throughout the country. So those are two things that I would point at directly for that specific question.
And since Harry did such a great job with that, I'll try the second question. We already pay our crew members $15 an hour for the work that they're doing with us. It is significant. It's significant for us. We're a small organization, but it's still not enough because we know that our crew members with kids can't support their kids. And even a single person, it's hard in Allegheny County to lead a decent life at $15 an hour. But we're still one of the organizations that has insisted that level is important. We try to work with other employers who our crew members will then move on to work with them to retain those levels of jobs. And it's really, really hard to find jobs unless they're union jobs that are $15 an hour. So I really think that this depends upon a real conversation between the unions, in my case in Pittsburgh, and organizations like mine, so that we can figure out finally how to have people represented within the unions who have had really struggled to be there before.
I appreciate you saying that, Elisa. I do think we can learn a lot and should look at cores that have already figured out how to do this partnership well, right? So I'm thinking of, for example, the Los Angeles Conservation Corps, right? That has explicit partnership agreements with unions like LIUNA and IBEW, where while they're in the Corps, their participants actually get industry recognized credentials, and then there's a clear articulated pathway into registered apprenticeship programs where they're actually not starting. They like start at the second apprentice level, right? So they already it's sort of the analog of like carrying over credit from one educational institution to another. And I mean, just that one Corps, about 50 of their graduates every year go into these kind of apprenticeship programs. So let's look at what works and let's figure out how to scale it. I would say also, and this speaks a little bit to what Harry said, we have great examples, great models of both targeted hiring and community benefit agreements that have been used over and over again on big infrastructure projects. I think we can import some of those lessons to the CCC and other infrastructure projects that we're going to be investing in through a big Build Back Better plan.
Michael, you want to jump in on this, or do you want me to jump to the next?
I really don't have too much to add. I mean, I think they covered it pretty well. Just recruiting from within those communities that you're targeting and investing the funding in those communities is critical, because that's where the most opportunity is. So that's just going back to the first part of the question. But yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think they were spot on.
And Colin, if I can just add just another point.
Please, Harry.
Yeah, I wanted to just shout out our sister program that we have, Dream Corps Justice, which works on criminal justice reform. I think return to citizens should be a key to this as well. And part of this equation, Dream Corps Justice just launched the largest federal prison closing campaign ever. So we're working on that right now. And I think as folks are returning home, they should be placed directly into some of these jobs and have opportunities for long-term careers and long-term growth. So I think that just has to be part of the equation as we look at equity and making sure folks from all backgrounds have opportunities within the new CCC.
No, I appreciate you saying that. I think one thing that Senator Casey's, because of your leadership, Harry, because of Elisa's, because of others, is this point around returning Americans being actually central to it, and not just being a youth program, but being, and also helping seniors as well. I mean, there's like unemployment needs in a lot of places, and this is a way to do that. I think the very last question I'll ask, and this I'm hoping we're going to tie together a couple of questions we got in the chat. I want you to flash forward 10 years from now, 15 years from now. I want you looking back and say, I want you to imagine we were successful. What does it look like? What does success look like? What are those investments that were made? What kind of jobs and careers did we launch? And what are the things that get you most excited about where we could wind up? The greater union density, wealth building, as Harry mentioned. Creating those linkages between different institutions. I want you to take maybe 30 seconds to a minute each and talk about like your vision for success on the backside, and then hopefully you'll inspire us all to work together to get there.
I would just say fostering a greater conservation ethic in society and pride in our communities, by putting all of these out of work people back to work in their communities, just fostering that sense of pride and, self-reliance. I think that would be, a great benchmark of success for the program. And that's what we heard from, testimonials of folks who were engaged in the last CCC back in the 1930s, that it really built to their self-worth and their feeling of community and everything else. So that could help to heal some of the divisions in America that we're seeing right now as well.
Yeah, for me, I would say I definitely want to make sure we're looking at how do we, increase access to green space, and improving water supply and water quality, improving air quality, improving access to healthy and affordable foods, especially in environmental justice communities. But also, more importantly, not just having, thousands and thousands of great jobs, but also how do we look at this long term and say, what are some companies that can be created through this that are led by Black and Brown and Indigenous communities and folks, and create more jobs through that. Create, as I mentioned before, wealth building is so important. So not just looking at short-term gains, but long-term success that can help improve quality of life for not just now, but for the future.
I think for me, in 10 years, if I were to look around Pittsburgh jobs with municipalities, with the government, with the unions, with the water authority, and there were a healthy number of land force graduates working in the environmental aspects of those jobs, knowing that they're doing well, that they're buying houses, that they are supporting their kids, that they're able to further their own education, their kids' education if they want to, and that they're living healthy and happy lives, improving our world as they do so. That, for me, and that gets duplicated all across the country and Appalachia, so that it's everywhere.
I want all of those things. In our 20 seconds remaining, I will say that I also, in 10 years, want to live in a country that has demonstrated that we can do big things, and that we can build a public good together that creates a fairer, more inclusive, and cleaner country.
No, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Michael. I mean, I think it's the linkages, right? It's the connections, it's the scale of investment. But I think the thing that I heard loud and clear today is that it's grounded in community, right? It's grounded, it's local, bottom up, not top down. It's lifting up, folks that have been left behind and creating those opportunities. So I really appreciate all of you And hope everyone that had a chance to participate today learned a little. And I think, look, we're in a moment right now. And so I just encourage each of you to lean in on the advocacy side. Talk to your senators, talk to your members. The vision that each of these amazing 4 panelists laid out today, and the Senator Casey kicked us off with, is in play in this moment. And if the investments are big enough, the impacts over the next decade are going to be profound to lead to the kind of vision that each of the 4 of you just laid out. So I appreciate you all. And with that, I will turn it back to my good friend, George Rampton.
Thank you, Colin, and the panelists. I have to say, and Senator Casey, it's very nice to end with that kind of a vision. And we can really be hopeful that advancing the CCC reestablishment is the beginning of some of that vision. And thanks everyone for tuning in, as well as the Senator, Colin, and our panelists. This event will be available on the Atlantic Council website. It's on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please share it. We're trying to get the word out. I hope you all join us for some other upcoming events from the Global Energy Center, including our annual Veterans Advanced Energy Summit from August 2 to 6. You can find details on the Atlantic Council website, including how to register. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks all for participating.